Good evening. Welcome back to the Marion E. Wade Center. I'm Jim Beitler, the director here, and we have a treat for you this evening in the Bakke Auditorium. We are joined by award-winning author and illustrator John Hendrix, who is here to talk about his new book, The Mythmakers, The Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Most of you in attendance or via our live stream are probably familiar with Addison's Walk, the footpath at Magdalen College where J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Hugo Dyson went on their famous nighttime ramble, engaging in a discussion about myth and truth that helped to lead to Lewis's conversion. The story is something of a well-tread path in Inkling studies, but you've never seen it like this before, or seen the story of Lewis and Tolkien's friendship like this before. In a wonderful review of The Mythmakers for the New York Times, Lev Grossman writes, Hendrix lays all of this, that is the story of Lewis and Tolkien, out in eloquent prose and charming expressive drawings, colored in moody blues and purples and warm, appropriately dragonish gold. And then a bit later, Grossman says, The Mythmakers makes a powerful case that if Tolkien and Lewis had never met, they would have never written their greatest works. The world would be a significantly less elfish place. John is an associate professor who teaches illustration and typography in the Sam Fox School of Art and Design at Washington University in St. Louis. He's written books such as The Faithful Spy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Plot to Kill Hitler, which was a best book of 2018 by NPR. Drawing is Magic, Discovering Yourself in a Sketchbook, Miracle Man, The Story of Jesus, and others. His illustrations have appeared they've appeared all over the place. Newsweek, Sports Illustrated, Entertainment Weekly, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, Esquire, The New York Times, Time Magazine, and National Geographic. John has won 3 silver medals from the Society of Illustrators, which also recently named him the Distinguished Educator in the Arts for 2024. Please join me in welcoming John Hendrix to the Marion E. Wade Center.
Hello. So good to be with you. Wow, what an honor to be here and speak at this place. It's really an honor. I don't have my blue jacket. I'm dressed like Tom Bombadil. I have boots of yellow and jacket of blue. Well, okay. Hello. We can begin. So, if you know anything about me, you probably know this. I love to draw. I could have said that about myself when I was 4 years old, and I can say it today, basically. So, drawing has been a fundamental way that I have seen myself in the world. This is me drawing some pages from Mythmaker. This is not sped up. This is... It looks like it, but that's how I get all my work done. Anyway, drawing, the reason it's sped up is because drawing takes a long time, guys. It takes so long. Like, did you know this? There's drawings on every single page of this book. That's too many drawings. Yes, they take a lot of time, and usually you don't do them right the first time. So anyway, that is all to underscore. I start this work with drawing because this book is a work of art. It is not a work of scholarship. I really respect scholars. In fact, my biggest nightmare is to be giving a lecture about Lewis and Tolkien at the Wade Center with literal Lewis and Tolkien scholars in the room. So please go gently on me. But I do think as a work of art, I can talk to the scholars. And I don't generally go to primary sources. I read secondary sources. My job is not to discover new truth about Lewis and Tolkien, but to synthesize. And my task when I write for middle grade audiences, and that is my audience, is to take something complicated and to make it legible, to translate it to an audience, to put a handle on something so you can pick it up. So these kind of usable histories, this is the way I learn. It's the way I love to read, and like a TED Talk, someone takes like their 30 years of scholarship and then boils it down to 9 minutes, and it's something that illuminates my life. Because most of the world, I mean, sad to say, are not scholars. Most of us are normal people trying to learn stuff in the world. So, that said, I did read a lot. I mean, I think of myself in these projects as kind of an amateur expert. I've read like 2 more books than you. So I do take it with a lot of humility. David French had this quote I heard recently that your humility should be indexed to complexity. And I feel that with every project. Like, I start the project knowing the most in my mind, and somehow the more I read, the less I feel like I know. And that is a phenomenon of learning. But really, if I'm going back to the original book that started this project for me, it was this 1988 copy of The Hobbit, illustrated by Michael Haig. This is my drawing of my beloved copy. Beautiful Smaug illustration on the cover. And I carried this around like it was a Bible. Even after I had finished reading it and I would travel with it. And I don't know if I could have articulated why that mattered so much to me. But the illustrations, the story, they were a portal to me, to something. And I loved having it in my life. So really, this book, Mythmakers, is really fan art. Okay, that's a good way to think about what this is. And you'll know that when you read the book. I'm visually riffing on things I love about their stories. And actually, I think fan art gets derided sometimes. Like, if you see a young person, an artist, making copies of their favorite work, I actually think that's a really beautiful thing. Because I think one of the phenomenons of really good art is it inspires more art to be made. Have you ever felt that? Like, I just went to see the 20th anniversary screening of Howl's Moving Castle. And I came out of the theater and I was like, I want to draw. The movie just excited. It reminded me of like, oh, I know why I do this for a living. So, this book was a labor of love. It's a 5-year project, kind of not really counting my reading time because I'm really a slow reader. The fact that I'm even an author is sort of bizarre to the 12-year-old version of me. Like, I hated the 5-paragraph essay. I hated writing. I did anything I could to turn an essay into a creative project so I would not have to write. So, I mean, just hearing you read that Lev Grossman review where it talks about eloquent prose, I mean, that's it. I'm done. I retire. But of course, throughout the book, you'll see, as I said, this is fan art. Giant spiders are not my personal creation. But inside this story, I ran into a problem very quickly so Lewis and Tolkien, basically all they did was talk to each other in pubs. And that is extremely uninteresting in a graphic novel. So I very quickly realized that I need 2 avatars to help me in this story. So I picked a lion and a wizard, totally at random. And these 2 characters help usher us through this story. They help us sort of do some of the things that Lewis and Tolkien were sort of talking about doing in their stories. So actually, fan art is actually what started their relationship, believe it or not. Like, at a faculty meeting, when they met for the first time, we know this because Lewis records it in his diary. He meets Professor Tolkien and later says in the diary that he was a smooth, fluent chap, just needs a smack or so, which is probably kind of a perfect way to encapsulate Professor Tolkien. But in this meeting, they begin speaking about Norse mythology. And they really should not have been friends. They were kind of the odd couple. They were very different, had a lot of similarities. But the thing that bonded them was this love of Norse mythology. It would be like going to a meeting, a faculty meeting, some boring meeting, and somebody across the table is wearing like a Wolverine shirt. And you're like, oh my gosh, you love Wolverine? It'd be like that. They like geeked out on this shared fandom. And I think that's a really important hinge to think about when we think about their friendship. Okay, so Tolkien had this amazing concept of subcreation. This is the one place where I think I don't need to explain any of this stuff, but maybe I will a little bit. The idea that only God creates truly from nothing, ex nihilo. That was the idea of creating from nothing something. And Tolkien believed that human beings cannot do this like God, except in one particular place, and that was inside our imagination. And Tolkien believed this was not just something that was like fun or entertaining or escapist, but it was actually a kind of holy act. To image our Creator in this way, to make in the manner in which we were made, was to honor God himself. And that's why he felt that the fairy tale was the highest form of narrative art. So in the book, Lion and Wizard get to ride a dragon at one point. The dragon helps us understand subcreation a little bit. Wizard hits a button that says subcreate, and a bunch of little dragon kites pop out. See, isn't this fun? This is what you get to do when you draw a book instead of, go to Oxford. I couldn't get into Oxford. So again, here's this quote from Tolkien. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. So the reason why I made this book, I feel like I'm still in the preamble, but why in the world add anything to the collection of Lewis and Tolkien scholarship? This has been a very well-trod Addison's Walk path over the years. What could I possibly add to this? So I think that Lewis and Tolkien subcreated several things together. They subcreated, of course, Narnia and Middle-earth. We know about those. Those have been illustrated a gazillion times. I would love to illustrate those. HarperCollins has not called me about that. So I think the third thing that they subcreated together, which is, believe it or not, equally a fantasy on some level, is the world of the Inklings. And now they were very real, but the sort of longing for a literary life with friends in a dark pub, talking about poetry at the end of a day, this is a longing we all share. And in some ways, I think they subcreated that world together. I mean, I am a literal professor. How many times do I go to the pub to have poetry with my friends? I mean, only like 6 or 7 times a week. No, I rarely at all, right? So to me, what I wanted to do was illustrate this world. I wanted to illustrate this third subcreated thing that they made together, and to bring it to life in the same kind of fantastical fashion as any of those other stories. So of course we get to slip into Eagle and Child. I mean, one of the cool things about this conceit with Lion and Wizard is that I really wanted to be careful with this book. I did not want it to be a gimmick. And I wanted the book to sit with nonfiction books in the library. Despite it having a talking lion, I longed for it to be nonfiction. So any of the scenes where we see Lewis and Tolkien talking, that is sourced to a real event. We know that conversation happened. We don't have a transcript. I did my best to get as close as I thought I could. But the truth is, I wanted to spend more time with Lewis and Tolkien. So Lion and Wizard gave me a little bit of a hack. I could sort of spend time with an imaginary version of themselves, traveling the story in parallel. Sadly, Eagle and Child is currently closed. It was purchased by a hotel group, and I know some folks over in Oxford, and everyone's very nervous. I just can't imagine that they're going to gut the place, but no one really knows what's going to happen to it. So let's hope it is. I was able to visit before it was closed, fortunately, back in 2019. That's not the original sign, by the way. The Rabbit Room is the place in the back where they met, had a lot of their conversations together before they opened that secondary section to a new part of the building. This is Wade Center content only. So there's a couple Wade Center Easter eggs in here. Of course, the one true wardrobe. Okay, let's settle the debate right now. And then, of course, this little teacup in the bottom. You might notice that in the cabinet out there. So go find that. All right. Also, there's Lewis's teapot shows up in several pages. So. Again, Easter eggs in books like this are only to keep me interested, all right? So if you see them, that's just kind of a bonus. So on my trip to Oxford, again, I describe it as Inkling's Disneyland. I went to just lots of really moving sites, Tolkien's grave. Still, I mean, when you visit, it's just full of mementos and fan art and drawings and letters. Same with Lewis's. This is the Rollright Stones, just north of Oxford, about 40 minutes. And it's a Neolithic circle similar to Stonehenge, but this area is full of Anglo-Saxon burial grounds and was very influential for Tolkien, like the Barrow-Wights and Tom Bombadil section of Fellowship. Of course, the kilns, spent a lovely day there. The typewriter, often used for many of his manuscripts. The original Eagle and Child sign. Lewis's writing desk. It's really worth a visit if you're ever in London. It's not that far, so I really recommend going north to visit the kilns. His bedroom, lots of fireplaces. Fireplaces show up in my book a lot. Partially because I'm really interested in the idea of portals and doorways in this book. It's kind of a central metaphor that I use. And you can see how something like on-site research begins to find its way into the story in one way or another. So this book is really about fellowship and kind of capital F fellowship. You know, not just being friends, but a shared purpose together. A shared purpose that they almost discovered by accident. Again, it's worth revisiting. They did a project together that was not really planned by them. Like everything that happened with their books was an outgrowth of a genuine love of making the art. They did not set out, they had careers, they had faculty meetings to go to, and yet in their spare time, they were writing fantasy books together. I mean, it really is insane. But before we go a little further in the book, I want to go to art school for a couple minutes. Can we do this? Do you mind? Because I think actually this is a very important thing to understand about why I make my books and why they work. So any like function of illustration is a relationship between these two things, words and images. There is a kind of fellowship that is formed between these two words. In fact, Norman Rockwell, most of his career was not really an illustrator, and we think of him as the sort of quintessential American illustrator. He was actually more of a genre painter because he was doing the Saturday Evening Post with no text prompts. He was coming up with an idea and painting it. Whereas in pure illustration, the words and the images in concert is what really matters. So let's look at this for a minute. When we have words and images together, and we combine them in the form of a book, the Codex gives us this beautiful vessel to combine words and images together. There's some magic that happens. You don't get this. You don't get a kind of like oil and water separation. You get something different. And in art school, we call this a gestalt. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. So in an illustrated book, there is neither singularly word or image, but a third thing that is neither word nor image, but both somehow. And this is the thing that you experience in your mind. And it's one of the superpowers of illustration, and it's the thing that I think God gave us art for this reason. It allows us to translate in this secret third language things that kind of can be said in no other way. So I think of this as an enchanted intersection, and that the book, particularly, the Codex, is a very enchanted form for this particular concoction. So, in fact, Lewis agreed with this concept. He, of course, eschewed anyone who told him that He was going to convert a lot of children in America to Christianity, so he came up with an 8-part plan or a 7-part plan to like build this world, and each thing was going to have an allegorical value. No, he always said these were supposals. These were responding to images he saw in his head. He saw a fawn carrying a package in the snow under a lamppost. What in the world could this story be about? Well, he went to write to find out. So the images were central to his storytelling. And actually, in many ways, I think of myself very similar to Mr. C.S. Lewis. But images to me are always where my stories begin. Like they start almost always as images that I want to make, and then I write around those images. And this particular relationship, this illustration as fellowship between word and image, is kind of foundational to understand in both illustration, but in particularly my own work. Like if you look through my books, the concept of fellowship is kind of all over in one form or another, from Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Frank Fisher to John Brown and Frederick Douglass, Lewis and Tolkien, The Prodigal Son. It's over and over. I'm interested in the visual concept of this fellowship. I mean, even my sketchbook book is sort of like making fellowship with your sketchbook. I mean, okay, that's a little bit of a stretch, but... So Lewis said this: "Nothing, I suspect, is more astonishing in any man's life than the discovery that there do exist people very, very like himself." And this is kind of the central fascinating concept about Lewis and Tolkien, is they really should not have been friends. They were extremely different. One was an Anglican who would become an atheist. One was a Catholic. Lewis grew up in Ireland. Tolkien grew up in England. Like, these are very different lives. And yet, they came together at this perfect point where they were able to give each other the perfect gift. This is my concept for the book. We could not have had their works without each of them giving the other, well, almost like a Galadriel level gift. Now, this may be your Galadriel, or this might be your Galadriel. I actually really like the Rings of Power. Let's just talk about Rings of Power. No, I won't do that. But this, Hildenbrand, this is my Galadriel, okay? This is what I grew up on, the Tolkien calendar. We don't have the rights for this for the feed, so just guys, you are looking at an incredible, beautiful Galadriel in this weirdly sort of stoic forest. It looks like a set. You know, it looks like a backdrop. All of their paintings are like this, and there's something about these images that just take me back to 1983. Anyway, okay, getting lost in Galadriel. So there were these precise gifts that one gave the other. And for Tolkien, what he got from Lewis was simply encouragement. That's all it was. It really wasn't true critique. Lewis famously said, you could never truly influence Tolkien. You could sooner influence a Bandersnatch from Through the Looking Glass. But what Tolkien needed was simply a fan. He said this: "The unpayable debt I owe him," Lewis, "was not influence, as it is ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby." In fact, Lewis had the bizarre, Tolkien says later in that letter, Lewis had this bizarre love of being read to. So they would get together and Lewis would have the pipe, I'm sure. Just imagine this. Tolkien is reading drafts of Lord of the Rings to Lewis, and Lewis is just sitting back and soaking it up and just loving being inside the story, right? This is what Tolkien needed, and it's a good lesson for those of you who make art. Sometimes what you need is just the presence of other people to enjoy your work, to tell you that was really good. Keep going. And there's letters from Lewis and Tolkien that we have seen where Tolkien hit a roadblock and Lewis said something, we don't know what, that helped Tolkien get through those writer's blocks. And of course, there is the famous wager that happened at Eagle and Child, where they're sharing a pint in the pub, and they're complaining about how there really isn't any good literature written for adults that are fantastical, that are like Charles Williams' The Place of the Lion, mythic, epic, but for adults. And so if you didn't know this story, well, they decided to flip a coin. One, if they got heads, would take time travel. The other, with tails, would take space travel. Well, they flip the coin, and Lewis gets space travel. And he writes a trilogy, basically instantly, that gets published. Tolkien was enraged by this, of course. His story that he wrote was called The Lost Road. It was instantly a disaster. He hated everything about it. He rewrote it several times and finally abandoned it. At the end of that story, there was a giant wave that crashes into the city, and he did take that. That became the Numenor mythology. So both out of this coin flip, there were things that were made from this single wager that lasted. But actually, that pattern of Lewis writing quickly and on the first draft, maybe revising a couple words here and there, but he did not go back and revisit work, unlike Tolkien, who at one point when he got stuck on Lord of the Rings, considered rewriting all of The Hobbit to make it older, to match the tone, because he was annoyed that the one was so young and he was writing something that got a lot darker, sort of without him realizing it. And the gift that Lewis got was, this is a quote from Alan Jacobs, he learned to read the story the right way. So the biggest grief in Lewis's life when he met Tolkien was that, as he said, everything he loved in his life was imaginary. He had lost his faith. World War I has broken his spirit. He was a cynic. His poetry was cynical and terrible, by the way. And the world that he saw that was real was grim and bleak. But the things that he loved were the imaginary stories, that Norse mythology. And so what Tolkien gave him, as we've alluded to on that Addison's Walk story, what many scholars call this single conversation one of the most important, single conversations of the 20th century, which, what are the other things on that list? I want to know. But if you've never been to Oxford and to Magdalen College, this is in the middle of Oxford, but there is this sort of beautiful gate you walk through, and suddenly you're just lost in an enchanted wood. I mean, it just takes a few steps, and it's a couple miles around the river. And on September 19th, 1929, I believe, Lewis, Tolkien, and Hugo Dyson are walking Addison's Walk, discussing the history and story of myth. I'm going to try to read comics out loud. Should I try that? Within moments, the three had seemingly disappeared from Oxford, lost in an enchanted wood. Now, Tollers, I can certainly agree with you on the basic enjoyment of myth. Fantastical stories resonate with all humanity for that very reason. Their similarity across time is obvious. Proof that they give us the dreams we need, an experience of joys that we are unable to have in reality. This is Hugo Dyson. Come now, Lewis, you're a theist now. You think we can't experience joy in the here and now? Lewis says, don't catch me out, Dyson. You know what I'm getting at. The great myths, though enjoyable, are simply not true. And lies, at their core, are worthless. Are we not in the pursuit of eternal truths? Much as it grieves me, myths are lies, breathe through silver, but lies all the same. No, Lewis, says Tolkien, myths are most certainly not lies. So this conversation continues throughout the wood. I had always wanted to read this conversation. Now we know this happened because Tolkien wrote about it in a poem to Lewis, Mythopoeia. Lewis wrote about this conversation, but I had never seen it imagined, and I wanted to be present for that moment. When Tolkien basically says, Lewis, the myths that were told echo the myth of the Christ story because God wanted us to understand what myths do, so that we would say, when the myth finally came true, oh, there it is. I recognize that. That is what I've seen before, but now it has finally come true. So again, when Tolkien lands that final blow in the conversation, Christ is the myth that entered history. He is the myth that actually came true. They both record this giant wind that ripped through the trees. It was a very still night, but suddenly just a rushing gust of wind. And it freaks them out, and they go inside immediately, but continue talking late into the night. But again, so this story to me is part of when I thought about making this book, I wanted to try to be there inside of that moment and recreate it as best I could according to the notes that we have. So this gets to a wonderful concept that you may have heard of before, but it's inside of Tolkien's writing, and it's very central to the real thesis of this story, and that is the eucatastrophe. You've never heard this word? Tolkien conceived of it as the sort of anti-catastrophe. It comes from the same root as Eucharist, so grateful, and strophe, turning over, so like the grateful turning over is what the word means. And it's basically, in fact, you could criticize some of Lord of the Rings because there are too many of these in the book. He was so obsessed with this, they're basically everywhere. And inside the book, I really wanted to unpack this idea for kids in a visual form because it's just so interesting. In this essay that all of you should read called On Fairy Stories, 10 years ahead of when Tolkien is really getting into Lord of the Rings, he's basically making a case for why fairy tales really matter. And not just they're not entertainment, they're not escapism. They are looking towards the greatest of all escapes. So what he says is that fairy tales give us these three things: escape, consolation, and recovery. And so in this visual retelling, I'm sort of putting the armor of God on the lion here, building up to the final moment when he says, actually, Mr. Lion, the thing that all these add up to is the hinge on which all fairy tales turn, the single unification of escape, consolation, and recovery. Oh my. Tolkien created a beautiful word for this collision, the eucatastrophe, and all real fairy tales have it. The anti-catastrophe. You've probably felt it in your heart when you've read a story. Oh, goodness. That moment when all hope is lost, and then suddenly, without warning, there is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. Giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, as poignant as grief. Oh, the happily ever after. Even better, a longing to live forever in joy. It is the universal desire for the greatest of all escapes, an escape from death. And Tolkien was so obsessed with the eucatastrophe because to him, Easter was the original eucatastrophe. Maximum defeat followed by maximum joy. That was utterly shocking and surprising. So you could probably think of 5 eucatastrophes inside of Lord of the Rings right now if you wanted to. But again, he was chasing that feeling. That feeling was why he was writing, in my opinion. So, Lewis and Tolkien had come together. They each were sort of given the right key to open the door, and they had to pass through that door together. And in fact, there's lots of doors in this book. I really like drawing doors. That would be one of the things that on my 100 things list of things I like to draw, if you've done Drawing is Magic. So there's doors all over the place, and the portals actually, I have a little fun with the portals. I've always wanted to do illustrated footnotes. So in this story, there are a couple sort of choose your own adventure portals you can take and go to the back of the book if you want to continue reading about the history of fairy tales or the roots of mythology and all that. But actually, I can blame my editor, because they were inside the story originally, and he was like, there is no way a kid is going to get through all this in one chunk. You've got to give them an escape hatch. So one of the beautiful things about what Lewis and Tolkien did on this shared project they did was just how important stories were to them. They had this little shorthand that they called the Horns of Elfland. It was from this Tennyson poem, and it was basically when they wanted to sort of shorthand the idea of that fleeting glimpse of joy you get when you read a fantasy story. Lewis called it northernness. And so they would often describe the blowing horns of Elfland as the sort of mysterious quality found in all stories. In fact, we get to see one of Lewis's first adventures into the power of that feeling here. So Lewis says, I was just talking about this, that Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, is like weirdly frustrating for me as a biography. He spends about half of the book, like this guy was in World War I, he spends half of the book talking about being sent to boarding school and how horrible it was. And so in one of the passages, he's just basically in misery. His mom has died. His father has no idea how to process the grief and has sent him away alone to England to go to a school where he is basically tortured by older boys for an entire year. Anyway, in his sorrow, he walks into a classroom and he finds a magazine with a fantasy story in it from Wagner's Ring Cycle. And it's illustrated by Arthur Rackham, one of my favorite illustrators. And I think it's this image. I really don't know. Actually, there may be somebody here who knows what image was on the cover. I think it was this one. But he sees that, and it transports him out of his misery into the north. And this was that fleeting sense of joy, a heartbreak of joy. I think that is the thing that sort of smuggled itself deep into his heart. And that was the little thread that Tolkien was able to pull on in that conversation on Addison's Walk. It allowed him to sort of square the circle of like, wait, that thing that I felt was real. And it was valuable. And like, maybe I could go there more often. Maybe I was created for that feeling. And so in this book, I get to use a little journey with Lion and Wizard. They go to the north together. And they go to the Tree of Tales. And in the Tree of Tales, they get to go through a portal into fairyland. Again, but you know, if you're 10 years old and you maybe don't want to learn about the history of the fairy tale, you could just go to the next page. So, okay, let's just pause for a second. It's really important to remember this. They did not know that they were the C.S. Lewis and the J.R.R. Tolkien. They did not know that there would be a center dedicated to their works. They were in between faculty meetings. They had crisis at home. They had families. They had responsibilities. And yet here they are doing this basically like hobby together. I think there is absolutely a universe where Tolkien dies if he'd never met Lewis, and they find 10,000 pages in his closet of the Silmarillion, and they're like, oh, look, this Oxford professor had this weird like hobby of making these made-up languages. That's kind of weird. But again, it's easy for us to forget. They were not setting out to sell 250 million copies of their most famous works. That was not their goal. And in fact, in their life, they were really not wealthy. Lewis, famously gave away most of his profits. It caused a huge tax debt for him early on because he didn't know anything about money, really. But one of the things I actually love about this for artists is that really, really great art is made by extremely normal people, right? It is easy to enshrine them as geniuses and to think of them as never making any mistakes, never getting frustrated, never having the bonds of their friendship stressed. But that is what happened to them. This passage from Tolkien's letters I just absolutely adore. Friday, April 14th, 1944. I managed to get an hour or two writing and have brought Frodo nearly to the gates of Mordor. Afternoon, lawn mowing. Aren't you like, no, Professor Tolkien, go back to the story. Someone else can mow the lawn. Or Tuesday, April 18th, 1944. I hope to see C.S.L., Lewis, and Charles Williams tomorrow morning and read my next chapter on the passage of the Dead Marshes to the approach of the gates of Mordor. The afternoon was squandered on plumbing, stopping overflows, and cleaning out chicken fowls. Okay, so just remember, Tolkien is probably bent over in his suit that he had taught in, cleaning out chicken coops, trying to get back to the writing table. And that is extremely relatable, right? Like, you're like, when am I going to get to the art making? I've been like doing all the preparation, and yet then, like at my house, like our fireplace doesn't work, and now it's getting cold. And so like, I've got to have the fireplace guy come over. It's going to take a whole morning. Like this is exactly what I feel like. And it happened to Tolkien and Lewis. So we're almost done, I promise. Then we'll have a little time for chat. I know there's actual children here who want to get to the fun part. So this book to me is really about the richest idea of fellowship, and I think I stole this from Jim earlier today in an amazing lecture that he gave. But really, I don't want to enshrine them as geniuses. I really want to use them as an avatar to see the thing that they were looking at, the thing that they were trying to capture. And in this book, it's all over it. It's the elusive joy that they were trying to find. As Andrew Peterson says, when those waves of the new earth crash up onto the shores of our earth ever so slightly, we get a few echoes of that in things that we experience in this world. And I think that's what they were after. This is what I stole from you. Don't make them a spectacle. This is Lewis talking about how to read literature and think about the author. Don't enshrine the author as a genius, as a spectacle. Instead, use them as spectacles. Oh, Lewis. Oh, standing ovation. All right, I'll close with this and then take a few questions. This is from, of course, Lewis in The Four Loves. In a perfect friendship, this appreciative love is, I think, often so great and so firmly based that each member of the circle feels, in his secret heart, humbled before the rest. Sometimes he wonders what he is doing there among his betters. Life, natural life, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it? That's part of the closing pages in my book. So, thank you for coming. Okay. Now, when I speak at elementary school, something I say is, who has a really interesting question? Because if you ask kids who has a really good a question, they just shoot their hands up and they have no idea what is in their mind. But if you're an actual scholar, you're not allowed. Okay.
Well, I guess that makes two of us, right? So here's my question. You're a graphic artist, I take it.
Yes.
I'd like you to comment on another graphic artist named Peter Jackson, who put out these movies that allegedly followed that plot line pretty clearly.
I've heard of him.
Why in the world did Tom Bombadil not make the cut?
So, all right. Do you have 2 hours? I have so much to say. Honestly, this is one of the reasons why I love Rings of Power. I think they honored Tom Bombadil so well in that show. Well, okay, are you wondering, would Tolkien have liked the Peter Jackson movies? No. No, he didn't like anything. And so when people say, this is what, when people are like, but Tolkien didn't like Narnia. Yes, he hated Narnia. He hated everything. So you just have to put it into context that, like, again, he was not a grump. He was just very particular curmudgeon about his art, you know? And we all have that, as Lev Grossman said in the review, we all have that bad art friend that's just like a little too snooty about the things that they like. So, okay, all this I think probably Jackson made the right call not putting Bombadil in there with the tone of that first movie. Because again, as people say, Tom Bombadil is Middle-earth's little weirdo. You know, he's actually, in my opinion, an avatar for Christ in the story, but it doesn't quite work because he's so silly. But anyway, I do think he's a valuable part of Middle-earth, and is basically the most powerful person in all of Middle-earth. Like it's very fun. Anyway, yeah, great question.
I'm just curious, with you as a visual artist, how do you evaluate Tolkien, who was a visual artist too, in some of his things and some of he created? How do you his graphic creations, how do you approach them? What do you think of them?
Man, great question. So let me let you into a little bit of Tolkien's insanity. In On Fairy Stories, he said the one thing you cannot do with fantasy, because it robs the reader of world building and imaginative sort of splendor, is to illustrate it. Now, he illustrated his own stories. Okay, so maybe he changed his mind, but also I love his work. But I have a whole lecture I give on this where if you think of two art school concepts. The glyphic, which is like shape language. Imagine like the Nike logo. And then the Vedudic, which is like the painterly. Imagine like a Bierstadt landscape painting. I think what Tolkien was writing about was the Vedudic. The world-building painting was sort of robbing something of what the imagination does. Now, what Tolkien made was glyphic. It was more design language. So in my opinion, Tolkien was a graphic designer, and he just used pen and pencil to do that. And so I think his works as design are really lovely, and I don't like when people describe them as amateur or he was a hobby painter. I mean, he was a polymath for sure, much like William Morris, one of his heroes. Yeah, great question.
Now, you did say that there are some Easter eggs that you put in the drawings that are just for you.
Yes.
But I really am very curious. Do you have like a favorite or something that you just kind of grinned as you drew in the corner?
Yes, there's a lot for my family in there. So there's little things for my kids. I'll hide something in a bookshelf that's just funny to me. I reference some of my other art in various places. It's all very navel-gazy. But again, there are some little Easter eggs for people who know Lewis and Tolkien's stuff. Like Lewis famously only had one digit in his thumbs. And so at one point the wizard chastises the lion for maybe dropping the lantern, and the lion is like, "You can't make fun of me because of my single digit in my thumbs." So there are things like that, and then that moment sort of references the lost torch in, is it Caspian, where where he loses the torch? Yeah. So there's little story Easter eggs as well. Again, when you have 5 years with a project, it's like, how can I make this interesting to myself?
My daughter wanted to know when you first started drawing.
Oh, wow, great. I don't remember a time before drawing. That's how long I've been drawing. So my first drawings I actively remember was tracing over Garfield in the Sunday papers. Do children still know who Garfield is? You do? Okay. The youth are going to be all right. If Garfield continues, the walls of civilization will hold.
We could all get on the phone to HarperCollins and bug them about.
Let's do it.
Money.
The space trilogy has never really been adequately illustrated in my mind.
In fact, this is my question: is there a book that's never been illustrated that you would love to do?
Oh.
If you got to decide. So maybe it's space trilogy.
Honestly, I would love
something
a
else.
crack at Paralandria. I really would. The Hideous Strength, Tolkien hated it because he thought it was Charles Williams fan art. I love it because of how weird it is. It would be a challenge though. Silent Planet would be a lot easier. But actually, one of the things I didn't talk about in this book, but just in the physical production of it, this is not a Pantone color. These are not 4 solid inks. It's a CMYK color build out. That means you could print any color you wanted, basically. But I use these limited colors intentionally. So it very subtly, the book dims in saturation as the book progresses, and it's not something I talked a lot about in this talk, but of course their fellowship did diminish and even break towards the end of their life. So as the book progresses, you sort of get this sense that the saturation is leaking out of their world together. But of course, if I'm writing a story about Tolkien and Lewis, I couldn't not give them their own eucatastrophe of sorts. So, I get a 5th color that breaks in towards the very end, which has not appeared anywhere else in the book. And that little concept was one from the very beginning. I was like, I want to do this trick where it looks like limited color, and then there's this magic 5th color that appears. So that's part of what I did.
Hi.
Hi, sorry.
It's okay. Tolkien was a Catholic, and C.S. Lewis, I think when they met, he was an atheist. And then I think Tolkien helped convert him, not to Catholicism, to Anglicanism.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any idea why? I mean, I would assume a Catholic would convert to Catholicism.
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably could maybe trace it to Lewis's upbringing. It was just a tradition that he was more in line with, but also in some of his, he had this exchange with Barfield that was very important to sort of punching at the edges of theism, and he eventually got to the point when he was at the Addison's Walk moment where he was basically a theist, or he had been beaten down to the point where he couldn't say that God was not a possibility. So that's where he was at the Addison's Walk moment. But, you know, as he crossed over to actual faith, which is a very famous passage in Surprised by Joy, which I do depict of him just driving with his brother on a motorcycle to the Whipsnade Zoo. And he says in the book, like, when I started out, I didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And when I got to the zoo, I did. And to me, I think this is a model for all evangelism. Just put people inside cars on motorcycles and drive them to the zoo. Yeah, it's very good. Sorry, okay, right here.
Do you journal your process, how you make your art? Because hearing your stories, it's fascinating. It would be neat to like have a book about how you do everything.
Thank you. I love process, and I will send you to my publisher so that they can. I don't really have a journal. All of everything, when you see a book, for every page, there's like 10 versions of that in drawing and 10 versions of that in writing that you never see, that don't come into the book itself. So that stuff in book terms is called foul matter. And so the foul matter left over from a book like this is a huge stack. So again, a lot of it extremely uninteresting, and most of it, it's a mess. I mean, the process, when you look at the book when it's done, it looks like, oh, what a clear idea. This was just a work of, just from the immediate, he just knew exactly what he was doing. And, you know, it's a train wreck from moment one. You just have this sense of an idea, and then as soon as you begin, it almost instantly proves that it was a terrible idea. And almost every process is like that. And there's a kind of despair that comes when you incarnate an idea. And that's right. Okay.
The Wade Center would be very interested in your foul matter.
You can have it all.
I have two questions. The first one is I heard somewhere that 80% of the Disney artists are left-handed. So are you left-handed?
I am not left-handed.
Okay, that's my first question.
This is why I didn't get hired at Disney.
And my second question is, have you ever thought of illustrating the screw tape letters?
Oh, I mean, again, I would love to. You know, they unfortunately have to give me permission to do that. But, okay, so here's how I've gotten around it. So screw tape letters was very important to me. I wrote a book called The Holy Ghost, which is, believe it or not, hilarious comic strips about the Holy Ghost talking to woodland creatures about theology. Okay, so the idea that you could make something, you could impersonate deities, essentially, and make it funny really blew my mind when I first read Screw Tape Letters. So my current project I'm working on, which is my next long-form graphic novel, is a retelling of the Salem witch trials, because oh, that's good, that's good. Should have recorded that, I could send that to him. I'm very interested in what Christendom thinks about the devil and demons, and I'm not sure we have a very clear idea about it, and the Puritans also did not have a clear idea about it. And they were very smart, thoughtful people. Anyway, all that to say, I'm thinking a lot about devils. So maybe I will get to Screw Tape Letters. Okay, right here. Oh, sorry. Back there first.
Oh, no. She can go first.
No, you got the mic, so you're in charge.
All right. It's important. I love the relationship, the friendship between the two. And I think on like how important that is in writing, and I'm only starting out, so it's like I'm curious from your perspective, when it comes to deep friendship, it's very spiritual. How does that shape your journey?
Yeah. Well, you need people you can trust. You know, I run a graduate program in illustration, MFA Illustration and Visual Culture at WashU in St. Louis. And something I tell them all the time, which they usually do not believe at first, is that our work always gets better in community. Most of the world tells you that artists are loners, and that is the way we make our best art, that people will steal our ideas, or the primacy of the authentic artistic idea is diluted when you add other people to it. These are all false liturgies in my mind. And so having a crit group, having something that you can share with others that's truly vulnerable, I think that's probably a way to start.
Have you found the right one?
Yes. I have really good friends at WashU, fellow professors that I've shared my work with. I have a good friend right here who was my first reader for many of my Holy Ghost comics. So I trust him to tell me when something is extremely not funny. So, you need, but it hurts, you really like your ideas. So, yeah. Okay, how about right here?
This is going back to talking about the process that you have.
Oh, let's do process.
And you said that it feels like a train wreck and it's a disaster sort of throughout. And I'm wondering what keeps you motivated, and maybe if you had any of your own little eucatastrophes throughout this process.
Honestly, writing the very final segment of the book, which I don't want to spoil it for people, but I really wanted to give Lewis and Tolkien a moment to talk about their lives together, and it had the potential to be extremely corny and saccharine and, I don't know, kind of diminish the authority of the rest of the tale. And I really wanted the story to end that way, and I couldn't get it to work, and it drove me insane. And actually what I would do is I would write a section of dialogue, and then I would go to sleep. And again, I'm a fan of sleeping. I believe your brain will solve problems for you subconsciously. And then I would get up the next morning and read it and be like, trying to simulate someone reading it fresh. And it would be like, oh my gosh, it doesn't work. But there was one iteration where I threw everything out and started over, and I read that the next morning, and it's a little embarrassing to say, but it kind of got me. I was like, oh my gosh, that's great. Where there was something turned in my own heart at my own writing. Extremely embarrassing to say that, but it was proof that it really wasn't mine. I was able to get a hold of something that was kind of true or something. So you just have to iterate. That's the biggest thing I tell young artists, young makers. You got to write fast, you got to write a lot, and you can't put too much weight on any one thing. The more you make, the more data you're going to have to evaluate if that thing was good or not. Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
2 more, okay. Make them good.
I was wondering when you first became published or broke into becoming a published illustrator.
Well, I went to New York after undergrad and worked a couple terrible jobs in public relations, and went to graduate school in New York to be a famous artist. And my very first book that I signed, I wrote a draft about John Brown, and I had made a connection with the art director for Harry Potter, David Saylor, and he saw my work and bought the idea on the first pass. And I was like, this is easy. Picture books are simple. Well, I worked on that book at Scholastic for a year, and then David Saylor called me into his office and said, we're dropping the book. It doesn't work. So I felt at age 26 or whatever, well, my shot has come and gone. So then it was another 6 years before that book found another publisher. And I basically took it to every contact I could find in New York. And finally it was an editor, Howard Reeves, at Abrams Books, that loved the story and loved my take on him. And again, this is what I tell people about publishing. You do not have to convince 1,000 people that you have a good idea. It's one person. It's one editor that is going to take it to an acquisition board and say, I want to work on this book. So you have to be persistent. You have to listen to criticism and actually change things. But at the end of the day, I found a person who saw my vision in the book, and I still write for Howard today. I've never written for any other editor. Yeah.
Time for 1 more question up front.
So in Faithful Spy, you pick mostly a red and a cyan, red and a cyan for the colors. You have 4 in this book, largely. I'm wondering, were there moments where you regretted the color choices?
Yes.
Was there a moment where you felt like, this is why I did this and it worked perfectly?
Yeah, well, what you're of course not seeing is all the different versions that I tried. And I had a very different color scheme where I did 8 pages in that color scheme and got to the end and it was like I had the exact thought of this is not working. And went back, and it's very depressing to think that. You've done all this work, and I rebuilt it, and finally, through trial and error, found a palette that, if you took this palette and copied it on a photocopier, it would still work. So like the values are really balanced. But in terms of the hue selection, you know, it's kind of an intuitive thing. And I wanted to reference Easter. So I used purple and yellow, which kind of hints at that a little bit. But it all started with the one color that never changes was the dragonish gold. That was when I had the lion as a character. I'm like, I've got to have that amber color. So then everything kind of rotated around that. But yeah, great question. That'll be in the book, the process book, The Art of the Mythmakers.
Please join me in thanking John Hendrix. Now we have a book signing with John Hendrix. We have already sold out of all of the copies of the book that we had. So those of you who are lucky enough to get a copy can get it signed with John. There are more copies being printed, is that right?
So if you're having trouble finding it, there's some good news, bad news. The bad news for you is that the entire first run sold out in like 2 weeks. That's very cool for me, that's bad for you. They are reprinting it right now. If you do not get a signed book tonight, I have some bookmarks that you could take, and also just email me and I can send you a book plate just to your address that you can stick in your book. So I'm sorry we don't have enough books, but soon. They'll be here soon.
It's a good problem to have.
It's a good problem, yeah.
We have one more event this semester that is on December 5th, Christmas at the Wade Center, 7 o'clock. Tim Larson speaking on the most wonderful time of the year. I hope you will join us. Thank you and have a good night.